All right. Yeah. All right. So these next two sessions will be the last two sessions on Christian philosophy, and what we'll kind of be doing today. We're going to sort of look at social philosophy and political philosophy the next 2 weeks. We'll look at more on the family and marriage today, and then the state next week. And most of this now is to sort of, you guys had decided that next semester we would do kind of looking at Catholic life in America. And so what some of this will do now is kind of prime the pump for that, to get us sort of thinking about how society sort of should be, and how America sort of matches up, and how much the church could be integrated into American life, and places that would need to be changed, and things like that. Okay. So that's sort of like the goal, the end game of what we're going to talk about. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about. So if you guys remember when we did when we did ethics, we did the natural law. Do you remember the four innate sort of goods for what you attached to human nature? Remember what the four of them were?
Existence, like
yeah.
preservation.
So life, preservation of life.
Marriage and procreation, education of children.
Mm-hmm.
Society, living in society.
Mm-hmm.
And the last one was knowledge of the truth.
Yeah, knowledge
especially
of the truth,
transcendent.
right? So all of those things are things that, by human nature, we just sort of we have a natural sort of pull towards, right? A natural desire towards. And then we said each one of those natural desires match back to some precept of the natural law, like do not kill because life is an intrinsic good, right? All of those things are intrinsically good. Contraception was wrong because marriage isn't anything that harms marriage is an intrinsic evil, right? Okay. So in the midst of that, right, we said that living in society, the man has this natural draw towards living in society. That's sort of stamped inside of him, right? Go ahead.
I say, how do we apply that to like a hermit?
So if you remember, we talked about how those things were sort of ordered, and you might give up one of the lower ones for the sake of the higher, right? So think about like a martyr. He gives up his life for the goodness of the truth, right? And so contemplating the truth, a hermit might give up life in society and marriage. Okay. So that would be the idea, right? So still an intrinsic good, but it's that sort of has that pecking order of things, right?
And same for like monks or nuns being secluded,
right?
In some of those situations.
So
yeah.
I was thinking, please God, we all go to heaven, and then we'll still have number one, right? Because we'll still exist, and then we'll still have number three because we'll live in communion with the saints, and we'll still have number four to an extent, But like number two goes away. So why does number two go away?
Yeah. So does number two go away for sure, or does number two go away in the sense that number two was a sign all along anyway of your union with God? Like, so in other words, like marriage goes away only in the sense that it was meant to be a sign anyway, right, of the union between God and man, and each one of us individually, right? So it doesn't necessarily go away; it's fulfilled. Instead of, if you look at it that way instead, which makes sense because, like, ultimately what that is, it's when you're in heaven, is your human nature has been completely fulfilled, right? So you don't just have life; you have life to the full. You have the life of God in you, right? You're not just married, but you're wedded to God. You're not just living in society, but you're living in the communion of saints, right? You're not just contemplating truths; you're seeing God in the beatific vision. So all of those things find their fulfillment.
What about the creation of people?
Like the procreate. Well, so that's one of the things that Jesus sort of throws people off with, right? He's like, there's no procreation in heaven, right? Like that part is done. Because, again, if you look at what's the purpose of procreation?
Just to get people to heaven.
Yes, to raise people up, like, for the heavenly society, right? So once that's fully populated, that part also goes away, right?
But couldn't you also argue that the love is fruitful? So, in a way, the procreation of...
Yeah, for in this life, that's how love is, like, ultimately finds its fruit, right? Life-giving, love being so the love between the spouses being so deep and so fruitful that a third person comes from it. Well, you step into the real thing when you step into the life of the Trinity. Does that make sense? Okay. So anyway, so we looked at those four things, and remember we got all sort of those by just looking at human nature itself. And so one of the things we can say about man is that he's social by nature. Okay, and so that's where I want to sort of use as our takeoff point, and just sort of saying it matter of factly, and then we're going to talk about if we can prove it, and we'll talk about how it's sort of so contrary to what the way our culture, American life, liberalism, all of that is sort of set up. Okay, so Aristotle says, man is by nature a social animal. He who is unable to live in society or has no need because he is sufficient for himself must be either a beast or a god. And from the Catechism, the human person needs to live in society. Society is not for him an extraneous addition, but a requirement of his nature. And we'll come back to that in a second. All right, so here's my question for you. How can we prove that man is social by nature?
You mean deductively? For
Yeah,
certain?
Can we prove it deductively? Can we only do it inductively? How can we do that? So it would be either one. You tell me.
I mean, I think inductively, I don't know. I mean, people are happier when they're around people when someone, I don't know, in the past, and this has happened the Catholic Church, it's they're trying to, if you're trying to break somebody, if you're trying to test them to the limit, you put them in a situation where they're alone, and so you kind of go against this to try to break them. So I think from those examples we can kind of see that it's really difficult. It's really against the grain of.
Okay, so sort of inductively, all of those make sense, right? So let me flip it around a little. Let me tell you what sort of the sort of prevailing mentality, really in Western culture now, but in the United States, sits on the fact that we're sort of all just individuals. Right? We're just rugged individuals, and we only come together in a society because it makes things easier. So we form these social contracts, and depending on where you're starting, it might be that that maybe what they call the state of nature is there's so much anarchy that the only way that we can be protected is to come together in society. But at the base of it is that we're just a bunch of individuals, okay, and that there's nothing sort of drawing us together. So, but are there things we can do to look at human nature itself, not just necessarily the actions, but look at human nature itself to say, yeah, I think we're social by nature?
We have mouths and ears.
There would be that, although other things have mouths and ears, right, but aren't necessarily social by nature. How about what we do with those, with our mouths and our ears? What's the final cause, or what is the purpose of our mouths and our ears from a human standpoint? Communication, right?
Well, communication, but you were to say animals also communicate. Granted, not to the same capacity.
Okay, so do animals really communicate?
Technically, yes.
So we're gonna do our little thing where we say
they don't. I don't think they really
terms,
share.
right?
I think when you say communication,
well, again, it's not
humans.
the same capacity, though.
Yeah, you got to define your terms, right? So what do you mean by communicate?
I mean, I think humans have an ability to communicate some self-knowledge, and from other people saying how they view you, you're able to gain self-knowledge. But an animal, I don't think an animal can have any kind of self-knowledge. It's kind of oh, there's a herd of bison coming. We better run away. Okay,
right.
Come over here. Here's where the food is.
And they can't communicate abstract ideas, whereas we can.
Yeah, that would be
The big one.
the big difference, right? So what we would call language, right, where you can communicate your thoughts, what are most intimate to you, you give to another person, and so that power. Remember, when we talked about. I think it was when we talked about anthropology, where we talked about where we look at a thing and we see that the action it can do, and we flip that over and we go, okay, that reveals something about the nature of it, right? And so we can look at this power to communicate to know that it has common in it, right? So it takes two. And so this ability to be able to communicate our ideas, and somehow my idea now becomes a part of you, right? So I've almost given a part of myself, right? And so this is what Leo the 13th said. He said, and indeed, nature, or rather God, who is the author of nature, wills that man should live in a civil society. And this is clearly shown both by the faculty of language, greatest medium of intercourse, and by numerous innate desires of the mind, and the many necessary things and things of great importance which men isolated cannot procure, but which they can procure when joined and associated with others. So go back to my four things. Every one of those ties back to some sort of social action, right? The truth as known and communicated. Well, how do we come to know the truth? Right? Through other people, living in society, obviously. Marriage, right? Marriage isn't just in the human respect. It's not just reproduction, right? It's procreation. It's creating with God, so that a community is formed in which children are then brought up and educated. Right? So that's what he essentially says. Okay, so we can look at human nature itself and go, okay, we're clearly social by nature. All right, that's not something that we just sort of all agree. This would be really nice to be able to do these things. Now, there's convention to it, right? Like how we form societies matters. But what St. Thomas says, and what we'll actually come back to that in a second. What St. Thomas thinks about it. So, all right. So, what makes a good society? Right. So, what's the purpose of it? What's the purpose of society, and what makes a good society? How many societies are there? How many societies are you all members of?
Well, I mean, it kind of depends on what you mean by society.
Okay.
Like marriage is a society, the church is a society. You know, you could extend it to be like my baseball team is a society. But maybe, you know, I don't know, the baseball team isn't that good of a society. I don't know. Right. You know, like things can be better or worse. But so I think there's lots of them.
So what makes a society then? Like why do people form societies, or why are they drawn to it?
Like the common goal.
Okay, common goal.
Also, just common need.
Okay, so
way to fulfill some of those common needs.
Yeah, how about we throw in sort of a Catholic term? How about we use the common good instead? That first one is St. Thomas. A plurality of persons united in a pursuit of a common good. And St. Augustine says, society is a group of people united by agreement as to the things they love. All right? So, why do we need society then? Let's start there, and then we can sort of back up a little bit. Why do we need it? Do we need it? All right, why do we need it?
A few slides ago, yes.
Yeah. Why do we need it?
I guess I would say from this, like to grow in the common good that you're looking for, but does that imply that you can't grow towards a common good without a society?
I don't know. Does it? Well, I mean, the answer to your question is yes, it does imply that because, well, first of all, because it's a common good, right? But second of all, because remember, go back to what I said about human nature, right? There's certain things that we need that make us thrive, right? Can a man be just without other people?
No.
Can a man be temperate without other people?
I mean,
where does someone learn how to be temperate?
What do you mean in that sense? I see.
Yeah. Where does someone learn how to be courageous? Where does someone learn how to be?
It reminds me of this like show where it was kind of like the exact opposite of society, and it was just like horrifying, you know, because I would just see a little bit like walking through Tally. But it was basically like, it's almost something that like, man, that would be cool if this happened to me. But then you kind of watch the show and it's just like, you see how it's like totally opposite. It's like everybody, like some kind of apocalypse or something happens. I don't know the backstory, and there's one person left. And so like everything's his, like he has all the stuff. It's all free. You can go to the store and get all the things. But it's just like, it was just horrifying because he was just so lonely. I mean, it was disturbing,
Yeah. All right. So the important part for us to sort of grasp in this is that because we're social by nature, we need society to fulfill our nature, and there's certain things that we can't ever do on our own. Right. I mean, procreation is a great example, right? But virtue of justice, right? Where does someone learn how to live in society? Family, right? All right. So now we're going to sort of spread out a little bit, and so there are. We talked about society of a baseball team. We talked about the family. We talked about, I forget some of the other examples, right? But there are two of them that are natural. Okay, two of them that we form sort of automatically, even though they may look a little different at certain times. And the first is the family, and the second is the state. All right, so that's why we're sort of spreading them out. All right, why those two? Why can't we throw the baseball team in there? I mean, I'd be all for the baseball team.
So when you say state, I assume you're referring to just like a relatively small community of people, and that's because it's natural to form.
Yeah, I mean,
and of course, it would naturally be small. Just
try not to think of like. So what I want to make sure we do is we maybe it'd be easier to call it like civil society or
I would say like community.
Yeah, so I don't want to equate it with per se with government, even though that will play a role in it. So we said a society is anywhere that we find people coming together, pursuing a common good. All right. So we could say that the common good of the baseball team is to win games, right? The common good of the family is what?
From a natural or supernatural perspective?
Both.
From a natural perspective, procreate, teach them to survive. From a supernatural state, procreate and teach them to be holy. Okay.
So that sounds more like a goal. So when you are part of the as you're drawn into when you were born, did you find that procreating was a common good of your family, like that you were going to participate in? All right. So maybe we're missing something. So what would be the common good?
Virtue.
All right. So virtue, certainly, like the pursuit of virtue is important, but that could sort of get us to maybe we should define common good. Okay. Don't worry about the long definition. We'll break it down in a second. So what do we mean by a common good? Like, can someone just tell me there's sort of...
I mean, I think it's easier to say what it isn't.
Okay.
Like it's probably what it says right there. It's neither the sum of the parts nor just like the whole.
Okay, so there's no calculus involved, right? Where we just go, okay, well, we have this many people individually having good things, so it can't be just that, right? And we can't do it sort of like, okay, well, this thing. Give me an example of a common good. We'll just go bigger than the family, and then we can go back down to the family.
Just like defense of the country.
Okay, so defense of a country. All right, so we'll call that security. Okay, just to make it easier, just to make it cleaner. So why is that a common good?
So it's when everybody shares.
Everybody shares in it, right? And if one person shares in it, does it diminish it for other people? No, right? And in fact, when one person goes off to fight a war, as a soldier, right? And his family is suffering because he's gone, right? Is it just, well, too bad, you have to sacrifice this for everybody, or does he benefit as well? This has to be part of the common good. If it's a benefit, if it's a common good, then he has to share in it too, right? And so does he share in the good of security, even though he's paying a little higher price, right? So a common good is a good that flows back over every individual in society, okay? So like justice is a good example, right? Justice flows back over everyone and can't be diminished when it's being used. All right, so now, family. What's the common good of the family?
Like understanding the truth.
All right, so understanding the truth would be certainly part of it, right? Not diminish it. But so, go back to the definition. A society is a group of people united by agreement as to the things that they love. What brought the husband and wife together? Their love, right? Spousal love is the common good. Do the children share in that? Absolutely. In fact, when they don't, that's when families don't do very well, right? Like, so when you were born into your parents, I think you didn't share in procreation, but you share you're underneath the love of your parents, right? Like, and you guys have heard me say this before. Like, you'll get this when you have multiple kids. You're like, "Who's your favorite?" And my answer is always mom. Right? And they've heard it so many times now, and I'll tell them, like, you want that, like, because you are stable, you are secure, you know you're loved, you know you're not an accident. All of those things, you were not conceived as an accident. You were conceived because we love each other, and you are a fruit of that love, right? So all of those things, like, so the common good of the family is the love of the spouses, right? Because when that goes away, what happens to the family, right? And so that's why you can safely tell your kids, like, I love your mom more, because they want that, they need that. That's what gives them security, right? All right, does that make sense? All right, so that everyone in the family shares in the love of the husband and the wife. Kevin, you're looking puzzled. Or mind blown. I can't decide which one.
I was thinking about something else. Could you say that the goal of the society is to make it easier to get to that thing that they love?
Get it easier in what way? Like
it's
make
easier
it more
to do
accessible?
the good. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, you want to, we'll talk more about this next week when we talk about justice, but that's like the definition of social justice, like, truly, where social justice makes sure that everyone has access to the common good in sort of an equal way, where it's not necessary, because, like, distributed justice is kind of unequal in the sense that everyone gets what they need, but social justice, which is broader, is when everyone shares, like, and everyone makes sure that they have access to that, right? So, again, going into the family, like the love of the father and the mother spills over into each individual child, right? Like, there's nobody sort of left behind or left out. Does that make sense? All right, so then we would say that one of the other part of the family, one of the other common goods is unity, right? You're stable because you're part of a family. All right, so let's sort of maybe we can get this definition out there, and then we can just sort of maybe fill in any dots that aren't there. So, according to its primary and broadly accepted sense, the common good indicates the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. The common good does not consist in the simple sum of this, what Kevin was saying, sum of the particular goods of each subject of a social entity. Belonging to everyone and to each person, it is and remains common because it is indivisible. You can't break up, like, you get X amount of love, you get Y. Which, by the way, is one of those things that you always kind of wonder, like when you're as a parent, when you have your first child, and you move to the second child, and you're like, there's no way I can love that kid, like this kid, right? Because like, there's no way, and that's because the love is like you come to realize, oh no, that wasn't the case. Like I'm sitting here thinking that somehow love could be divided up. Like I have X amount of love that I can give to my family. Here it is, and I have to divvy it up.
I know it's cheesy, but the thing of like God's love is like a flame, and the flame doesn't diminish.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it
like
describes it well, right? Because it's indivisible, and because only together it is possible to attain it, increase it, and safeguard its effectiveness with regard also to the future. Just as the moral actions of an individual are accomplished in doing what is good, so too the actions of a society attain their full stature when they bring about the common good. The common good, in fact, can be understood as the social and community dimension of the moral good. So what does that all mean? So when we talk in just a second about like authority, the goal of the person in authority is to promote and protect the common good. All right, we'll talk about that in a second. We already talked about this, and we'll just sort of read the quote and then move on about the natural societies. Man's natural instinct moves him to live in civil society, for he cannot, if dwelling apart, provide himself with the necessary requirements of life, nor procure the means of developing his mental and moral faculties. Hence, it is divinely ordained that he should lead his life, be it family or civil, with his fellow men, amongst whom alone his several wants can be adequately supplied. But as no society can hold together unless someone be over all, directing to all to strive earnestly for the common good, every body politic must have a ruling authority, and this authority, no less than society itself, has its source in nature and has consequently God for its author. Hence it follows that all public power must proceed from God. All right, which we'll come back to in a minute when we talk about society. When we talk about authority in the family. All right, so each of those societies, the reason why they're natural is because within each one of them there is sort of goods, natural intrinsic goods that are perfected in us. All right, so let's start with the family, and then we'll spend a little bit of time on the state, and then we'll circle back around to the family. All right, so let's get a definition. It is a natural society in which husband and wife are called to give themselves in love and in the gift of life. Authority, stability, and a life of relationships within the family constitute the foundations for freedom, security, and fraternity within society. The family is the community in which, from childhood, one can learn moral values, begin to honor God, and make good use of freedom. Family life is initiation into life in society. All right, so without children, are you and Nicole a family?
I thought you said no to this before.
Does it have to do...
Well, so, it has to be true in one sense, yes, because, at least I think so, because in the rubrics for the wedding mass, they mentioned family, so, but...
Yeah, so
we clearly don't have children, so...
Yeah, so the answer, the answer is nuanced, right? So the answer is imperfectly, right? Because insofar as you haven't yet had children, but it's the foundation, think of it as a house, right? The foundation has been laid, right? And so is the house fully formed? No. Is the house fully formed once you have a child? No, right? So you're more perfectly, right? But not completely.
But the house does exist, like it's there.
Yeah.
It exists.
Yeah.
So what makes it fully formed then?
I guess,
when you reach what God had it, from that perspective.
Because what if He only wanted you to have one child, and
So then one child,
or you can only achieve that,
Yeah. Yeah. So don't get into don't think I know a lot of Catholic couples that do this, that the whole purpose is to just have as many little old lady in a shoe, right? Have as many children as you possibly can, and that's not necessarily the end, right? The end is to form a family in union with what God wants, and be open to that. But in a certain sense, there's no perfect family. So in other words, it's not complete until it's complete in the mind of God. All right, so moving now back towards like the question then of sort of what from the child's perspective, right? So the perfect sort of okay. So let's back up for just a second because I want to make sure something is clear. What is the end of marriage? What is the purpose of marriage?
To prepare us for heaven.
Okay, yeah.
Well, to prepare specifically your family for heaven.
Okay, so definitely.
I think it's a little tricky because, I mean,
I just want to make sure I think this is worth just talking about for a few minutes.
the book I was reading from Scott Hahn is talking about some of this stuff, and I mean, you quoted like two different. Well, he quoted the one pope was saying like in I don't know exactly what sense, but in kind of like a wider sense, like the chief purpose of the sacrament is the perfection of the spouses, but the primary end of marriage, and superior to the other ends is children, and then I can't remember. Probably number 2 is unity, and then the third one is probably I don't know society or something like that.
Yeah. So it all depends on how the perspective you look at it, right? So when we say that children are the end of marriage, what we mean by that is that marriage naturally is the natural place in which children are born, right? So marriage results in children. Okay, that doesn't mean that's the purpose, though. Like you have to be careful about. So the purpose of marriage is different, right? The purpose is, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is ultimately the perfection of the spouses, right? Which includes having children, if God willing. But very often people will say, okay, well, the end of marriage is to have children. And that's true insofar as it is true. It doesn't necessarily mean that, because people then flip it around and go, well, we can't have children, then something must be defective about our marriage, and that's not it at all, right? So it just means that the normal cause of children, as its end, like it's the effect, the cause is marriage. Okay, that's what that end of marriage means. So if you look at it sort of teleologically, okay.
I think we also can, I guess, gain some insight because I think the wedding mass, there's like one question before consent where it's like, talks about, lovingly accepting children from God and raising them in the law of Christ and His church. And I think like that gets admitted if like, let's say you have two 70-year-old people who are getting married, that's allowed, that's okay. And that'll actually get like, that's supposed to be like
it's still a valid
removed,
marriage still,
because it's like kind of,
right.
Yeah, they can't have children. So.
Yeah, so that's not as if like those people really aren't married, right? If we understand children as the end of marriage incorrectly, then you go, well, those people can't have children, so that's not a real marriage, right? And that's what I want to sort of avoid. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the state, and then we're going to talk about authority, and then we'll talk about some of the principles, and then swing into the family. All right, so what is the whole purpose of government? I'll just use a broader term, of the political community. Why does it exist? Why do we have a democracy? Why do we have whatever? Why do we have? It could be. What is the end of government?
To create a fostering environment for these common goods.
Yeah, so to protect and promote the common good. All right, so why is that important? Because everything that the government does always should have a reference back to the common good, right? So if you say, for example, let's look at something like abortion, right? Why is abortion wrong from a societal standpoint? Because it harms the common good, right? Why is something like contraception, why is that wrong? Harms the common good, right? So when you make arguments then in sort of the public realm, it always has to go back to the common good, all right? So you can't just say, like Catholics are guilty of this. They'll say, well, I believe, it's a matter of our faith that we believe this, right? Well, fine. Doesn't make it not true, but you have to be able to make arguments in terms of the common good. Okay. All right. And we'll talk more about that next week. But the whole purpose of the state is to promote and protect the common good. All right. So let's take an example, and then maybe this will help. Let's say that some presidential candidate is promising free milk for everyone. Right? Is that good? Can you make an argument as to why that's good or bad? So every morning you wake up and there'll be milk on your doorstep.
Doesn't matter where it comes.
Well, I mean,
It's not made by
I don't know,
Doesn't sound like it'll be good for the cows.
Yeah, let's just say there's an endless supply of cows. Right?
Okay.
Like they've been able to clone cows and they have them all in one place and they've controlled their methane exhalation, all that.
That's a trap, but yes.
Yes. Is that a good thing? Is that good for society?
Does it diminish people's ability to work for what they need?
Okay, so
Isolated by itself, I would say yes.
so what Nicole said is really important, right? So what is the purpose of, what is one of the things that is part of the common good? Like the thriving of people, right? What does it mean for someone really to thrive? Is it to have milk or something else?
I mean, to fulfill their nature,
Okay, which means they have what?
they have to work.
They have virtue, right? And so would having milk delivered increase or decrease the citizens' virtue?
Well, I think it depends, because if you have like the endless supply of milk, then there are people that are working you'll have more people delivering that milk, so they are working. There are
Okay.
more people working in that way.
All right, so I wouldn't dispute that. I would say that but the point is you have to be able to make the argument from the common good, right? So you can't just sum up and go, okay, well, this has stimulated the economy X way. You have to say, okay, well, this frees said people up to pursue virtue in this way. The milk suppliers now are pursuing virtue in this way, right? So that has to be the first and foremost question of every one of those, like all of those programs, right, where they try to sort of bribe people. The question is, does it make people better? Like not better off, but are they more? Does it cause someone to be more virtuous? All right.
Cause everyone to be more virtuous.
Yes.
That's the common good part.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it also seems like it's an important difference between like the state doing this and like what if there's some billionaire who just has a ton of milk and he's just like pumping it out. I think those are like very different things.
Yeah, which we'll talk about in a second, which is sort of like subsidiarity, right? Yes, so private versus public realm. For right now, maybe it doesn't have to be the state that gives the milk. Like, it's just the milk just appears. And somebody distributes it.
Like manna.
Yeah, like manna. Was manna against the common good? I don't know if I'm comfortable making that argument.
No, because there was order and work into collecting.
Yeah, right. So what did it do? It spurred the Israelites to virtue, right? Like they had to go out every day and collect it.
It was just they didn't hunger anymore, and then maybe the argument could be made for manna from heaven. That was ordered and there was work.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously, like the end game. I'm glad you brought that part up. So obviously, the end game is like virtue, right? But in order for someone to grow in virtue, they can't be starving, right? Like, so a small amount of like necessities are necessary, right? All right, so we'll talk about subsidiarity in a minute when we get there. Okay, so let's talk first about, because this is another one of those sort of American things, all right? So why do we need authority? Why do we need authority in the family? Why do we need authority with a husband over the wife? Why do we need authority, civil authority? Why do we need that?
I mean, it's one way to go at it. Like, was it St. Bernard said, a man who's his own master is a servant of a fool or something like that? I feel like that plays a part in it.
Yeah, there's certainly
like you
part
can't
of that.
know all this stuff, your government knows more about the government than you do.
Well,
Maybe
we
not that
can't
you
do
shouldn't have
everything ourselves, right?
Input
we've
into
already,
it, but
we've already kind of proven that, right? Like we've already talked about how, like, there's certain things that we can't do ourselves, right? We could all, we could all shovel our driveways, right, and shovel the road in front of our house. But what would that look like? What would that end up looking like, unless it's like sort of a higher part of society didn't do that for us, right? But why do we need authority? So I think it's James Madison in one of his Federalist Papers. He says if men were angels, they wouldn't need government.
I was thinking that, yeah.
Is that true?
The angels have authority.
Yeah.
So theologically he's wrong, right? First of all, like angels do have government, right? There's a hierarchy. I think we might have talked about this last week about that story in the book of Daniel where Daniel's waiting for Gabriel to come to him, and it comes like 28 days later, and he's like, the Prince of Persia, the guardian angel for Persia, wouldn't let me come, and then Michael had to come and straighten him out. Like you see this like hierarchical structure in Daniel chapter 10, I think it is. Anyway, so that part of it theologically he's wrong, right? But what is he really trying to get at?
He's saying if we were perfect, we wouldn't need order.
Yes, we wouldn't need authority or government. Is that true? If we weren't fallen, would we need government? Would we need authority?
No, I think we still do.
Government, not necessarily God's order.
Well, if we accept the premise that all authority comes from God Himself, right? Mm-hmm. And that He just uses secondary instruments to. Is it true that so the reason why I'm asking this is because if we begin to look at authority sort of as this necessary evil that we just have to put up with, right? Our approach to even our leaders is going to be very different, right? Like, if it's a necessary evil, I'll kind of tolerate evil leaders, right? But if it's something that's actually built into our structure as human beings, then I'm going to demand something different of those people in authority, right? So obviously the answer is that the authority, it's natural, all right? Why? And this, I think, will help us sort of pertain to marriage too, about why. So let's suppose you have two virtuous people, right? Both aiming at the same common good. Is there only one way to get that common good? No, right? Like, there could be numerous ways, right? Who decides? Like, husband and wife both want the same thing. Who decides? They can't vote. Okay, so maybe there should be an authority there to say, in the end, yeah, we both want the same thing. This is how we're going to do it. And then go bigger society, right? Like, again, assume virtuous leaders, right? Is there more than one way to get to the common good?
Yes.
Yeah. So does somebody have to come up and say, this is the way we're going to do it?
Yeah.
All right. So regardless of whether we're fallen or not, right? You still need authority. And so, who then should be in authority? Which is the second part. The prudent man, right? Like the prudent person. Who's, and so this is what St. Thomas is saying here. So it says, first, because man is naturally a social being, and so in the state of innocence he would have let us. I think the question was whether there was authority in the state of innocence. Because man is naturally a social being, and so in the state of innocence he would have led a social life. Now social life cannot exist among a number of people unless under the presidency of one to look after the common good, which is what we just said. And then second, if one man surpassed another in knowledge and virtue, this would not have been fitting unless these gifts conduced to the benefit of others. All right, so what's the second part he's saying? Like he's saying the person who is the most virtuous, the most prudent, most wise should be the leader. Is that even close to how we typically pick leaders? No, right?
It kind of turns into this, like, I don't know, like, do they have good ideas and how likely are they to actually, like, get to them kind of thing.
Yeah, well, there's like a calculus involved in it, right? Not like the man of character will make other men better. It's more worried about like how am I going to be better off than I was 4 years ago, kind of thing, right?
Which I still think is like mistakenly adjacent to the same idea of like the virtuous man helps virtuous men, but they just look for it in like shallow act. We just look for it in shallow actions instead of like actual.
Yeah. Yeah, and so what St. Thomas does is he says, well, the good leader is the one who is concerned with the common good. And he says anyone who's not that is a tyrant because he's concerned with his own good. And then obviously how harsh of a tyrant depends.
So if we're saying that like all authority comes from God, like all power, but there can still be leaders that are not necessarily like.
Yeah, so I mean, like look at the kings of Israel, right? Like directly from God, but they exercised it poorly. So he has all authority comes from him. There's not anything like the divine right. Like all his authority has to go to this person, right? How we choose or how God chooses doesn't necessarily matter per se. But what does matter is that he does it through secondary instruments, right? And so that's why, like St. Paul says, and I think St. Peter says in his letter, basically the same thing. They're like, pray for your leaders, but you have to listen to them, unless they're telling you to do something wrong. So the second point then that's important for us to sort of understand then is that like not everyone's equal, right? Like there are people who are more wise, who are more courageous. And so St. Thomas says, not that those people should be chosen to be leaders, but that they should take those gifts and use them. All right, so all that being said then, so why do we just blanket say a husband has authority over his wife? If he says this, how do we then turn and say, well, the husband should always have authority over his wife?
Is that saying he is always more surpassed in knowledge and virtue than his wife?
I don't know. That's what I'm asking. Like, is that, because I know some marriages where that's not the case.
I think from a supernatural perspective, the marriage is supposed to image the relationship between Christ and his church, and so it makes Christ is ahead of his, like St. Paul says, Christ is ahead of his church. The man's
although he
wife.
definitely surpasses anyone in knowledge and virtue.
Well, yeah, it's different. Yeah. I mean, clearly the man can be like, it's possible that the man could be, less virtuous than the wife in every respect, just like 100%.
So is it, should he have authority then, or should the wife? Like just because they, well, you're more virtuous. Why do we just blanket and say the husband?
It seems like it's easier than trying to weigh,
Is it just convenience, or is it?
It's not just convenience.
Yeah. I mean, we can certainly go from a sacramental perspective, right? Like, the husband has been given a grace of like office, right? A grace of office to exercise that office, right? So, but what about in a natural realm?
Well, so I think this kind of shows it, like, you start to see this, like, there's kind of this energy behind, someone being a servant leader or whatever. It's like, wow, like this, you hear that message of like, a leader is supposed to serve their people, and it resonates with you because I think it goes back to like the truth of like, like the Pope is the servant of the servants of God. Like he's over us, but his mission is to serve us and to help us. And so, like naturally, I think maybe we can see it from like the man is stronger on average, the man is able to protect, and so it's clear that his role is to serve, so it also, I guess,
so he's more able to provide security, right? He's bigger, stronger, all of those things, that's, by nature men are that way, right? Like individual cases maybe not. My wife showed me this video of you guys may have seen this, of this guy at his wedding reception who, I think it just happened recently, who rather than taking off his wife's garter, knelt down and washed her feet. Like that dude clearly gets it, right? Like, that was really profound, and people are like, "Oh my gosh, like that is, like, you know." And every married dude is like, "Why didn't I think of like? Are you saying why did I think of that?" Yeah, totally. Like we still got time. We still got time. I'll pretend I didn't tell you the story. You came up with it all on your own. No, I mean, I immediately was like, "Man, why did I think of that?" But that's grasping it, right? That's grasping what the leader's really supposed to be like, right? Like, and he's clearly getting like, okay, I'm supposed to be Christ. Here's what he did.
Is that something? Because I remember one of the popes did that where they would wash.
Yeah, I think on Holy Thursday, like priests, including bishops and pope, they'll wash like feet of the feet of the disciples, right? Like Jesus did on Holy Thursday.
And I think it was Francis, like he intentionally did like prisoners, I think.
Yes.
Volunteer one time, but yeah.
All right. All right. So a couple more things, and then we'll kind of round out the family thing. All right. So let's talk about like the presence of evils in a society. Okay. So should a government outlaw everything that's wrong? So again, should contraception be illegal?
Yes.
Should lying be illegal?
I guess it depends on how we punish illegal, because if it's only for we're looking for the common good, but the punishment doesn't if the punishment doesn't also benefit the common good, doesn't work towards the common good, then
okay. So yeah, I think you're kind of getting towards it. So assuming that the punishment is proportional, right? What would happen if we began punishing lying, for example? Let's say
we'd all be in jail.
Yeah.
it has to be proportional.
So how much evil would happen from that? Like just in the sense of okay, you lied, you have to go to jail for 2 days. All right, well that's now disrupted family life. That's disrupted the economy. It's like all these other evils come from it, right? So in this sort of perfect world, we would have everything be maybe be illegal. But you can't make a law, you can't legislate completely against everything, right? And one of the places you sort of draw the line is when more evil will come from the punishment than from the actual crime itself. So one of the examples is, like really unjust examples, is like 3-strike laws. You guys know, like when a person does something a third time,
like
whatever it is.
It becomes a felony.
Yeah, whatever it is, right? And while the places that have this, they see people, they might be about to get pulled over for a speeding ticket, right? And they're just gone, and then they end up crashing. People get hurt and all that, right? So you take this sort of unjust, like law, and then create further evil from it, right? But it even goes to like Augustine uses as an example, like prostitution. Okay, should prostitution be illegal? I mean, we all agree it's wrong.
Yeah.
So what tends to happen with? I mean, there's a sort of a big outcry of this now. Like, what tends to happen with prostitution? Who's the one who ultimately suffers? The prostitute, right? And the prostitute is starting out normally in a pretty bad situation, right? It's even being sex trafficked, whatever. So you see like a lot of people now moving towards. I think it's called the Nordic model. I think they did it in Sweden or whatever, where they didn't punish the prostitutes; they punished the brothels and the people that were paying for the sex and the pimps, right? And the prostitutes they didn't punish, and they found, prostitution is going away. So that's a case of sort of getting creative in kind of and not creating further evils by a law, right?
Repeat that. What did they do up there?
They began to They didn't criminalize prostitution. They criminalized the selling of it, like from brothels, the buying of it. I think it was the buying of it and the secondhand selling of it, so that the prostitute was not punished.
Punish those who benefit without sacrifice.
Yeah, and they found out that like prostitution all of a sudden was going away, right? but here's the nuance part that we have to make sure we sort of grasp. So if we don't make something like, say, contraception, right? And St. Thomas says the rule is like, don't make a law that's beyond the virtue of the people. Okay, so if we don't punish something like contraception, okay, so we don't have a law against it. What tends to happen when you don't have a law against things like that is people then think it's okay, and then it slides to promoting it, right? Which is exactly what we saw, right? So they decriminalized it, which just simply says we're not going to punish this anymore. But that became, in the mind of most people, okay, that means it's okay now. And then that moved to, we need to promote this. We need to pay for this. It's a right. Right? So you see how it went from illegal to now being a right. And that's how it goes, right? So that sort of inertia always has to be taken into account. When you have a law on the books, it's kind of a stupid law in the way, or unenforceable. It's still good to have because the law is a moral teacher and it says this thing is okay because most people go, well, can you do that? Well, it's not illegal, and so we often have to be careful about things like that. Okay, all right. So one thing I just want to sort of point out, and we'll talk more about this next week, is what John Paul II calls the art of the possible, and he's basically just talking about legislation. When there's already like pro-abortion laws that legislators want to get rid of abortion but can't, and so they just do what they can. Okay, and they sort of move everything away from it, right? And I think one of the sort of classic like historical examples of this is like the founding, right, where they knew slavery was wrong, couldn't really figure out a way to eradicate it directly without destroying everything. So they tolerated it for a certain amount of time, but built in all these little things to get rid of it over time.
Who did?
The founding fathers.
Oh, the founding. Okay.
Yeah. And things got held up and all that. But that's one of the ways that sort of understanding, okay, they had this situation where this evil existed, and to completely, totally eradicate it would destroy everything. They had no way to, maybe not even, there wouldn't have been a union. They had no way to, they had nowhere to actually take the slaves and set them, like the slaves themselves would be worse off, all those things. And so what they did is sort of like the art of the possible. Okay. All right, so let's talk about these two principles, and then a little bit on marriage. All right, so you guys have heard of subsidiarity and solidarity, right? So we don't need to spend a whole lot of time sort of defining them. So subsidiarity, now, what I want to make sure we don't, so subsidiarity, people tend to define it as the lowest possible order to take care of something. Okay, and the problem with that definition is that it makes it seem like that everything comes from above, like from the highest point, and it just trickles down. And they're like, okay, we'll let you take care of that, right? But what the definition really is that the most appropriate or the most ordered society take care of it. Right? So, education, for example, right? Whose job is it to educate? Who has the obligation to educate? The parents, right? Now, can the state help with that? The next sort of like local can help, right? But what often happens with that, though?
And the parents think it's not their job.
Yeah, that, and the state tends to think it's their job, right? So you see, like, you have to be really careful. So you have to be really careful that any aid that comes from a higher society is simply given directly to the person whose obligation it is, right? So I don't know. You could think in situations where they would maybe they would offer parents education classes on education or something, rather than educating the children directly. I'm not saying that's the solution in this case, but going back to the milk example, right? Like. Giving each family free milk. Is that better or worse than giving the father of the family access to go get the free milk?
What do you mean?
Again, a way to go get it. So he has to go and actually milk the cow. Milk the cow with the infinite milk. Who has no gas. because he ultimately has the obligation to feed his family, right? And to take that duty away from him actually makes him worse off. All right, so that's subsidiarity.
It's kind of like you're interrupting somebody's ability to gain in virtue, like grow in virtue.
Yeah, that's exactly. They can't. Remember, the whole goal is to fulfill themselves, right? And so they're lacking in a virtue because you've taken it away from them, right? And this is a lot of sort of the problem with a lot of sort of social outreach programs, right? Is they just hand things out, right? Rather than making it so that the parents can do it. All right, solidarity. All right, so solidarity is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, the good of all and of each individual, because we are all responsible for all. Okay, so solidarity is sort of the church's answer to Cain's question about whether you're your brother's keeper or not. So think of solidarity sort of as the antidote to like individualism, right? Where you take responsibility, going back to my sort of social justice example, for making it possible for everyone to contribute and receive from the common good. All right, and it's really, that's ultimately what it is, right? It's this sort of the means by which you sort of distribute and share in the common good. So let's talk about the threats to it real quick, and then this will naturally lead into marriage. Okay, so let me sort of, when somebody very passionate about the plight of immigrants, what virtue are they exercising?
I think kindness.
Yeah, well, solidarity, right? Like, that's an example of solidarity. How about somebody who really wants to take care of the elderly? Same thing, right? Okay, so so it tends to be that societies do that, right? But there's also another threat to it, right? Because it builds on top of. So what about if you were to say that a mother has no duties to her children, her father has no duties to her children? What is that offense against? Solidarity, right? When you create a culture where that's the case, can you then expect people to care about the immigrant? No, right? Like, when a husband no longer has any obligations towards a wife, can you expect them to take care of their parents when they're older? Right? So remember, now we're going back to what I said earlier about how the family is the foundation of society, and how what happens there then trickles or spreads everywhere else, right? So again, this is not to say like, okay, well, until we fix the family, we can't do anything about immigration, whatever. But it's to say that when you break natural obligations and natural duties towards solidarity, you can't build solidarity at all. Okay, so it may be their pet project, but the fact that that we then ignore those things, and the fact that we make it so that clear and natural obligations are no longer obligations, you can't build solidarity. Okay, so let's now move into marriage. All right, so let's look at first the definition. Okay, so I have two definitions up here. Marriage is the complete union of two persons. It is the total union of their persons at every level of their temporal being, spiritual, emotional, and bodily. All right, so that's definition number one. Definition two is marriage is a consensual, intense, romantic relationship of two people that is unlike any other relationship. Which one is a good definition and which one is a bad one?
Top one is the good one.
Okay. Or are they both okay?
Well, I was going to say, I think the second one isn't necessarily opposed to the first one. It's just missing a lot. Like, it's not incorrect. It's just very, very imperfect. But
yeah, I think, I don't know. I mean,
that's what I think it's
the second one kind of seems to be, I don't know, it seems suspiciously similar to the, like, you know, it's like consensual sex outside of marriage is okay. It's like, what? No,
Okay, so in a culture of consent,
like if you want to do something bad and I want to do something bad and we're both on the same page and that's good, it's like, no, it's still bad.
Right.
All right, so putting those definitions aside, if I asked you for a definition of marriage, what would you say? Yeah, so something like along the lines of the first one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So somehow this comprehensive union of two people, right? And what's wrong with this second one then? So remember when we talked about definitions, how do you make a definition? Remember, how do you form a definition of something?
You need to know your terms.
Yeah, but so that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to but if I want to define something, what's a rule of definition? Remember? Genus and species, like what class the thing belongs to and how it's different from the other things in that class, right? So we'd say marriage is in the class of relationships, right? All right, and how does it? What's its specific difference from other relationships? Does the second one?
Complete.
Yeah. What does the second one capture? Could I say that if I took the word marriage out of there and if I said the consensual, intense, romantic relationship of two people that is unlike any other relationship? First of all, they cheated, right? Because they tried to make the specific difference be that it's unlike anything else. But so, could I put another word in that for marriage? Dating.
Yeah,
Dating
that's
is
what I was
the
going to say.
consensual, intense, romantic relationship of two people.
Right.
Okay. How about a fling?
Yeah.
Is the consensual, intense, romantic relationship of two people.
Similar.
Like-
Yeah.
I mean, the unlike any other relationship is vague because it seems you could argue that any relationship is different than any other, so therefore any relationship is unlike any other.
Yeah.
It's not really telling you much.
Right. So he was
Okay.
trying to get those other things, but couldn't. So it's just like, it's unlike.
Yeah. So clearly, there's an attempt to sort of evade the question, right? But there's another reason why, using the terms we've used now, why the second one is wrong and the first one is right. What's missing in the second one?
At every level.
Say that again.
At every level.
Yeah, every level is part of it. But what's the common good in the second one? So if we're forming a society, there's no common good, right? Will the two share, assuming they could share consent, an intense romance? Do two people share that equally? It's not possible, right? Like different things. Okay, so there's no common good necessarily in that relationship, right? So nothing to build upon. What's the common good in the other one?
The union.
The union, right? Like
I mean, it sounds like a good
on
building
all,
block.
Yeah, on
you,
all levels, right?
Order
So-
them together, and
Yeah, because it's unity, right? All right. So that first definition, I think, came out of Robert George has a good book on marriage, and then the second one obviously came out of the Obergefell decision. Okay. All right. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the goods of marriage, and then we'll talk about divorce. Okay. So St. Augustine says there are three goods of marriage. Right, so the fidelity. So I'll read. Let these nuptial goods be the objects of our love: offspring, fidelity, and unbreakable bond. Let these nuptial goods be praised in marriage by him who wishes to extol the nuptial institution. Right. So these are what are called the goods of marriage. So what marriage? The goods that are attached to marriage itself. Right. So the first one is obviously offspring. And the second one is fidelity, where it's one man, one woman. And then the third is the indissolubility or the bond itself. What do all three of those things have in common?
they're shared.
Well, they're shared, but they're also
Common.
permanent. Yeah, they're permanent, right? Every one of those things is permanent. right? Even the offspring, right? Like you've created a soul, like it's permanent. Okay, and so so within that sort of that first definition, there's also a comprehensibility, right, of time, right? So they give their time forever, right? And so these goods. Now, can we say these goods are shared by any other relationship? Is there any other relationship that has fidelity, indissolubility, and offspring? Answer that question. No.
Naturally.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So when we're sort of deciding what's marriage and what's not, we would look for these goods, right? So let's talk a little bit about this then. Why does the state even care about marriage?
Because it has a lot to do with the common good,
I mean, yeah, obviously, right?
and that's their job, is to help.
Okay, so if their contribution to marriage is the common good, right? Should they treat that relationship differently than friendship?
Yeah.
Okay, why?
It's a significantly bigger impact and importance.
Yeah, but ultimately, the state cares because everyone who will enter civil society has been in a family, right? Ideally, and so how that happened, like how they're brought up, really matters to how well societies. Like, if you want to destroy a society, like this is the sort of the Marxist model, right? Like, we're going to destroy the family. Marriage and the family goes, we can then control everything, right? And so when you destroy sort of a culture of marriage, you destroy the culture as a whole, right? So then let's talk about why they would allow divorce, and maybe we can talk about
Why
sort
the
of
government would?
yes,
Because it's convenient.
but what if it ultimately? That's obviously the answer, but if it harms the common good, why? Why do they allow it? Ultimately,
I think the initial idea is probably what we talked about, avoiding the greater evil. It's like, the perception is allowing it produces.
so
It's like if you're approached as like it was an abusive relationship,
Right.
the government would approach it as it's more evil to allow that to continue.
So remember at the beginning when I talked about that there is a foundational understanding in the West about human nature, about it being individualistic, right? Not social by nature. What does that then say about marriage?
That it should take second. Like the
Well,
individual
also,
should
it's
take
saying
precedence.
marriage is individualistic. Like it's
Yeah,
about yourself.
yeah. It's just a social contract, right? It's just the rest of the social contract, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think because it's kind of scary. Like, you see, like I don't know. I feel like I encountered this in college. This idea that I think like the baseball team is a social construct. It's like you don't need the baseball team, but like marriage is not a social construct. But people argue that it's a social construct. Like, oh, we just decided to do it this way.
Yeah, can you argue against that? Because I think that's a good. Can you argue that marriage is not a social construct?
I think parts of it are, but not at the base level as we've approached it here.
Yeah. This actual definition of marriage, I think, is not. I think there are social.
Yeah. So what it looks like. Are there cultural differences across time and space?
Mhm.
Again,
Not to, like,
in the way that we, not in this way. No, there's not.
Not really, right? Like,
You could call them accidentals almost.
yeah, I mean, there's accidental differences, like,
Yes.
right? Like,
Right.
when the Jews got married.
Yeah, I'm
they
thinking like
waited
what
6
clothes they
months
wear.
to consummate the marriage.
Which I think is the point you're trying to get around, which is like outside of those, no, at the base level, marriage is relatively the same.
Yeah, the marriage. Why? Why is it the same? because it's natural, right? Like it fulfills what our human nature, right? And so it's not a social construct at all. But so going back to, so if we really believe that man is like this rugged individualist, right? Then there's consequences that follow from that, right? So that idea has consequences, right? And the consequence is marriage isn't something natural anymore. It's just something two people come together because they have an intense romantic relationship. They kind of like each other, make good roommates, whatever, right? Like across the line, right? And so then if you have this idea, like, did the state invent marriage? No. So does the state have any power to dissolve marriage?
No.
No, right? But if it really is just a contract where it's just two individuals coming together, like, the state has to, right? And so the issue is not necessarily that that the state is sort of usurping power with divorce. It's the fact that there's a base assumption that's wrong, right? And the base assumption is that we're not social by nature, and that marriage is not something that we naturally do, even though all signs point to that, right? So until we fix the sort of the idea, it's really difficult to fix the consequences, right?
But I mean that, like, signing a paper saying you're divorced, it doesn't do anything.
Right.
No, because
just puts
the
ink on a
bond
piece of
was
paper.
never on paper, right?
Yeah.
The bond was never on paper. So, that, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's divorce it's impossible. Like, you can't do that. You can mimic it. You can make it seem like that's the case, but you can't, right? Because the couple that has been married, they are ontologically different. Like, you are different than you were 6 months ago. Like, in your person, you are different, right? And that can't be changed by a piece of paper, because the piece of paper didn't make it, right? So the first then is the sort of rugged individualist. Okay, the second problem is contraception. All right. So ultimately, why is it that we so readily accepted gay marriage? Have you ever thought about this? Like, why was it so?
Because we'd already accepted that procreation and offspring weren't.
Yeah, they're not this.
necessarily
Like, they don't. Marriage is not the place. Can be or cannot be the place for children, right? So when you divorce procreation from marriage,
unintended.
then why? Like, how is a contracepting couple different than a same-sex couple?
It's not in fundamental way.
In the end, they're not necessarily that different. Like, if you're looking at it from the outside, they're not really that different, right? One is morally closed off to life. One is actually physically closed off to life.
But some people would argue that, like, an infertile couple also kind of.
Yeah, but that's not
How-
so. Yeah, so
I
that, but that is
understand
not
it's
like two things. So it's not impossible for them, right? The way that it is for a same-sex couple, right? Like, they can. I mean, it is possible. Like, there's plenty of infertile couples that actually end up conceiving, right? Like, and their acts are intrinsically ordered towards procreation, even if, and in that way, are no different than a fertile couple's.
I would just say that the contracepting couple is a little different, though not necessarily bad.
Yeah, so yeah, I agree with you. So look at it from the sense of, like, try to look at it from the outside, in the sense of, like, if contraception is okay, why is sodomy not okay? Like, in that way, right? And I think that ultimately, I think that if people have done this, right? They've traced a line from like Griswold versus Connecticut, which was in like 1966, all the way through Roe versus Wade to 2015 with the Obergefell decision, because they all fit, right? It all started with, okay, we shouldn't really legislate contraception. The right to privacy says, if you want to keep your child or you don't, that's okay. And it just keeps moving in that direction, and it's ultimately like an attack on marriage.
I mean, I don't know. It seems like, I don't know, because like the the legal stuff has this kind of like precedence thing going on where it's like, but it's like it's different from the church, because when the church is like, kind of develops, it's consistent. It doesn't make a mistake. It's kind of like God's watching over it. But the United States Supreme Court, you just sense of like they probably really don't know what they're doing. Like they're just trying mentally to do this. There's probably a lot of forces working against them, and they're just penning it down. And all of a sudden, it's getting further and further away from the truth because it's hard for them, for whatever reason, to stay perfectly grounded in the rock solid truth that they may not have had to begin with.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of that becomes when, which I think we talked about before, when the Constitution is like the highest law. That's it, like nothing above it at all, right? You can't, like if you read Supreme Court decisions over the past 50 years, they never say anything about natural law, never. So it's always Constitution, 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 right? And so some of that is it's a conceptual, like they're missing the fact that the Constitution can't cover every single situation, right? And that there actually is something that covers every single situation. It resides in human nature itself, right? And so, so ultimately, I think that is the direction it has to go back towards. Like somehow they've got to get judges and legislators and all of that actually connect back to the natural law. And until that happens, it's just going to keep getting stranger and stranger, I think. All right, that's all I got. Questions? Comments?
I'm just thinking about what you said about like the Supreme Court and precedents, but it seems like an important part of the church is that it doesn't really ever depend on precedents. Like it's
well, the precedence is divine revelation.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's not human precedents,
Yeah.
I guess, is the importance.
I mean, you could say the church uses precedence in the sense that Thomas built up Augustine and people have built
Yeah, but it's
not the same
it's an
sense, like-
expansion, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there's it's the development of doctrine, right?
It's development, not a restriction.
And how would you separate those two different definitions, I guess?
Yeah,
between,
so
like, precedent
development
versus-
always includes the thing before it, right?
Mhm.
So
Does not.
so it doesn't overturn it. Like so you can't overturn something. That would be the first thing, right?
Right.
But it always somehow includes like the Immaculate Conception, right? Like that includes all of the things about Mary before. So it's not a new teaching. It's just it's the teaching about her divine motherhood expanded and understood more fully, right? Whereas if you were to just all of a sudden introduce that Mary is the fourth person of the Trinity, right? Well, that would contradict a lot of stuff, right? And so that wouldn't be a development. That would be a distortion.
Right.
Whereas, the Supreme Court has plenty of decisions where they overturn previous decisions. Like
Okay.
they're like, that one was wrong, now we're right.
Mhm.
And they'll probably do that again. Where the church never goes, that was wrong. They may say that was incomplete, or we need to further explain that, but it would never be that was
Well,
wrong.
how does the word precedence come into that? Because precedence, in a sense, is meant to be at least like development, where the court says, like, based on this previous decision, we're gonna judge it like this.
Yeah, it's trying to
I'm not
take.
saying they
Yeah,
do,
no,
but
but
that's-
yeah. I mean, in that respect, they're very similar, right? So it's trying to take what was implicit in the first thing and make it explicit in this case, right?
Okay.
Yeah, in that respect, it's like there's a certain amount of like development that should sort of naturally happen, but only in the sense of like application.